The night Martin's life changed forever was drenched in cold rain. The kind that seeped into your bones and made the world feel heavy. He had just finished grocery shopping, rushing to load his bags into the trunk before the storm worsened. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a single, rusted pickup truck parked a few spaces down. Something about it made him pause. Maybe it was the eerie way the headlights flickered. Or maybe it was the faint, pitiful whimpering that barely cut through the sound of rain splattering against the pavement. Curious, Martin stepped closer. The truck's bed was covered by a tarp, but something underneath it shifted. Then he saw it, a small, caged creature trembling in the shadows. At first glance, it looked like a puppy. But something was off. Its fur was jet black, soaking wet, but still unnaturally thick for such a small animal. Its amber eyes, far too intelligent, too knowing, locked onto his. It didn't bark. It didn't cry. It simply stared at him, watching, waiting. A shiver ran down Martin's spine, though he told himself it was just the rain. Before he could process what he was seeing, the truck's driver returned, a grizzled old farmer with weathered skin and tired eyes. He spotted Martin near the cage and sighed, shaking his head. "You don't want to mess with that thing," the farmer muttered. "It ain't normal." Martin frowned. "What do you mean?" The old man scratched the back of his head, reluctant to speak. "It showed up on my land a few nights ago. Thought it was a stray. Maybe someone's lost pup, till I found my chickens. Whole co-op torn to hell. Feathers, bones, blood everywhere. Some birds died from the shock alone. Never seen a dog do something like that." Martin's gaze flickered back to the tiny, soaked creature curled in the cage. It didn't look dangerous. The farmer sighed again, rubbing his face. "I can't afford to lose more livestock. Was gonna take it to the vet. Have him put it down. Best for everyone." Martin's stomach twisted. Put it down? Just because it was hungry? His fingers curled around the metal bars of the cage. The creature didn't flinch. It just stared. "I'll take him," Martin blurted out, surprising even himself. The farmer's expression darkened. "Son, that ain't a good idea." But Martin couldn't walk away. Something inside him screamed that he had to do this. That this wasn't just any rescue, this was fate. "Please," he insisted. "I'll take him far away from here. You'll never have to see him again." After a long, heavy silence, the farmer nodded. "Fine, but don't come back here asking for help if things go south." As Martin scooped the drenched creature into his arms, he swore he felt its tiny body relax, almost as if it had been waiting for him. He had no idea that he had just sealed his own fate. Martin drove home through the storm, the wipers barely keeping up with the relentless downpour. He stole glances at the small creature curled in a blanket on the passenger seat. Its amber eyes locked onto him through the darkness. It didn't act like a normal puppy. It barely moved, barely shivered, just watched. Something about that gaze unsettled him, but he shook off the feeling. He had made his choice. He had saved its life. By the time he reached his apartment, the storm had lessened to a steady drizzle. Martin carried the bundle of wet fur and sighed, setting it down gently on a towel. As he moved to grab food and water, he felt those sharp golden eyes burning into his back, not with fear, but with something else, understanding, awareness. He tried to treat it like any normal dog. But Luci, as he decided to name the pup, was anything but normal. At first, it was the little things. Luci never barked, never whined, never played. It didn't cower or seek comfort like other rescues. It watched, observed, every movement, every sound, as if analyzing its new home. Martin dismissed the eerie feeling in his gut, chalking it up to nerves. Then the other things started. By the third night, Martin woke up gasping, a dream of deep, unbroken forests fading from his mind like smoke. His throat was dry, his heart pounding for no reason. As he sat up, rubbing his eyes, he saw something in the dim light. Luci, sitting at the foot of his bed, staring, not sleeping, not curled up like a normal puppy, just watching. A shiver ran down his spine, but he forced a chuckle. "You're a creepy little thing, aren't you?" He reached down to scratch behind Luci's ears, and the pup pressed into his touch for the first time. Martin let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Maybe he was overthinking things. But the unease only grew. Luci was too smart. He never needed training. He followed commands Martin never even spoke out loud. Doors that Martin swore he had locked were sometimes open. Things in his apartment felt subtly moved, and the neighbors' dogs went silent when Luci passed them on walks. Shrinking away with tails tucked, whimpering in fear. Martin didn't want to admit it, but he was beginning to feel afraid of his own pet. Then came the night the power went out. The apartment was plunged into darkness. The hum of the refrigerator dying. The streetlights outside flickering once before going black. Martin reached for his phone. But before he could even unlock it, a low, guttural growl cut through the silence. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside. From Luci. Martin turned slowly. In the darkness, he saw only two things. A pair of glowing amber eyes. And sharp white teeth, bared in the dim light. His stomach twisted. For the first time since he brought Luci home, Martin wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. Martin's breath hitched in his throat. The glow of Luci's amber eyes burned through the dark, cutting through the silence like a blade. The low growl reverberated through the apartment, sending an unnatural chill crawling up Martin's spine. The power outage had plunged his world into complete stillness, save for the sound of Luci's breathing, deep, slow, too controlled. Martin swallowed hard, forcing himself to move. "Luci, easy, buddy." His voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. Then, in an instant, the growl stopped. The air felt heavier, as if something unseen had shifted. The apartment walls no longer felt familiar. Martin reached blindly for the flashlight in his drawer, his fingers fumbling. When he clicked it on, the beam illuminated the space in front of him. Luci was gone. The blanket where he had been sleeping was empty. The fabric twisted as though something had leapt away with unnatural speed. But the door was still closed. The windows shut. There was nowhere for him to go. A sharp sound, a claw scraping against wood. Martin spun around, flashlight trembling in his grip. His pulse pounded in his ears as the beam swept across the room. The shadows stretching unnaturally against the walls. Then, movement. A flash of dark fur. Something impossibly fast darting across his vision. Martin stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. His breathing quickened. "Luci?" His voice cracked. Then he saw it. The silhouette. Not a puppy. Not even a large dog. Something bigger. Something wrong. The shape was hunched, the fur on its back bristling like an animal poised to strike. But it was the eyes, those same. Burning golden eyes, that paralyzed him. They weren't just reflecting light. They were glowing. Then Luci did something that made Martin's blood turn to ice. It stood on two legs. Martin's body refused to move. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but his legs felt like lead. The thing in front of him, the thing he had taken into his home, fed, cared for, trusted, was no longer pretending to be just an animal. It had been waiting, watching, learning, and now, it was time. A sharp knock at the door shattered the silence. Martin jumped, his heart hammering. Someone else was outside, someone who had no idea what they were walking into. He turned toward the sound, momentarily breaking eye contact with Luci. Big mistake. The second he looked away, the creature moved, a blur of black fur. A rush of wind, something powerful slammed into him. The impact sent Martin sprawling, his flashlight flying from his grip and skidding across the floor. Darkness swallowed him whole. As his head hit the ground, his last thought was not of fear but of horrifying realization. Luci had never been his pet. He had been Luci's. A sharp ringing pierced through Martin's skull as he struggled to regain consciousness. The world around him was shifting. Blurred shadows stretched across the ceiling. The dim glow of his fallen flashlight flickering weakly from the floor. His body ached, the force of the impact still radiating through his ribs. He sucked in a shaky breath. But his senses screamed at him, "Don't move." Something was watching. A deep, guttural snarl rolled through the darkness. Martin's heart pounded against his ribs. He forced himself to stay still, listening, measuring the unnatural stillness in his apartment. Where was Luci? Then, a whisper of movement, a claw grazing across wood. Martin's blood ran cold. The sound came from above. His pulse thundered in his ears as he slowly turned his head. His gaze traveled up the far wall to the ceiling, and there it was. Luci was clinging to the ceiling. Its massive claws dug into the wooden beams, the thick fur of its back rippling with each shallow breath. Golden eyes gleamed with something beyond animal instinct, something aware. Martin felt his stomach lurch. That thing was studying him. And then, without a sound, it moved. Too fast. Before Martin could react, Luci leapt. Adrenaline kicked in, overriding his paralysis. He rolled to the side, just as a massive weight crashed down where his head had been. Wood splintered, shards scattering across the floor as the beast's claws dug deep into the floorboards. Martin scrambled backward, gasping. He kicked the fallen flashlight, sending it spinning toward the hallway. The beam cut through the darkness, casting Luci's full form into view. Martin's breath hitched. This wasn't just a wolf. Its limbs were too long, its shoulders unnaturally broad, the fur along its back bristled like spines, twisting and shifting as if the creature itself couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. But the eyes, the same golden eyes he had fallen in love with, held a look of terrifying recognition. Luci knew. Martin lunged for the flashlight, grabbing it in his shaking hands. He turned the beam toward the hallway, toward the only escape route he had left. And then, the door exploded inward. A blast of frigid air surged into the room, sweeping aside the thick, suffocating heat that had built inside. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. Martin's breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to process what he was seeing. It was the wildlife inspector. The same man who had first evaluated Luci months ago, the one who had almost taken him away. But his eyes weren't filled with shock. They were filled with grim understanding. "Move," the man shouted. Stepping inside, rifle raised, Martin flinched as a deafening gunshot shattered the room. Luci shrieked. Not a yelp, not a canine whimper. It was something else, something that made Martin's blood run ice cold. The force of the shot sent the creature sprawling, crashing through the broken doorway and into the hall. Martin felt his breath stutter in his throat. The inspector's voice was sharp. Urgent. We need to go. Now. Martin barely had time to react before the man grabbed him by the arm and hauled him to his feet. His mind raced, his body moving on instinct as they bolted into the hallway. Behind them, a low, seething growl rose once more. Luci wasn't dead. The hunt was only beginning. The forest was an endless stretch of darkness, the trees looming like silent watchers as Martin pushed deeper into the unknown. His breath came in ragged gasps, his hands trembling as he gripped the flashlight, the weak beam barely cutting through the fog that clung to the earth. Luci was out here somewhere, hurt, alone, scared. He couldn't let that shot be the last thing Luci remembered. The inspector had tried to stop him, tried to tell him that Luci was dangerous, that he needed to be put down before he hurt someone. But Martin knew better. Luci wasn't just some wild creature. He wasn't a monster. He was his best friend. And he was out there, bleeding in the dark, running from the only person who ever truly loved him. Martin stopped, scanning the twisted undergrowth. The wind howled through the trees, carrying whispers of movement that sent chills down his spine. Every instinct told him to turn back, that this wasn't safe. But then he saw it, a trail of blood, dark against the frost-covered ground. His heart pounded. He was close. A sudden rustle snapped him to attention. Martin swung his flashlight toward the sound, his pulse hammering in his ears. The underbrush quivered, and then, a deep, low growl rumbled from the darkness. Martin's breath hitched. His fingers tightened around the flashlight as he took a cautious step forward. "Luci?" he whispered, his voice barely above the wind. Silence. Then, from the shadows, golden eyes blinked open. Martin exhaled sharply. The eyes were unmistakable. Luci. The massive figure emerged from the darkness, slow and hesitant. His black fur was soaked from the rain, his body trembling from exhaustion and blood loss. The bullet wound on his side was dark and raw. And yet Luci didn't attack. He just watched. Martin lowered his flashlight, his heart aching. "I'm here, buddy," he murmured, taking a slow step forward. "I'm not gonna hurt you." Luci flinched but didn't retreat. His breathing was heavy. His golden eyes locked onto Martin's with something painful and conflicted. Then, in a move that shattered Martin's heart, Luci whined. It was soft, broken, a sound of fear, of pain, of betrayal. Martin dropped to his knees, ignoring the cold mud that seeped through his jeans. "I know, boy, I know," he whispered, reaching out. "I didn't want them to hurt you. I swear to you, I'll make this right." For a moment, Luci hesitated. His massive body shuddered, his muscles tense. But then, he took a step closer. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. There was still hope. But then, a branch snapped. Martin barely had time to react before the sound of approaching footsteps shattered the moment. Luci's ears flattened. His eyes darted behind Martin, and before he could stop him, Luci bolted into the night. Martin spun around just in time to see flashlights cutting through the trees. Voices calling out. The hunters had arrived, and this time, they weren't going to let Luci escape. Martin's heart pounded like a war drum as he whirled toward the approaching flashlights. The voices were sharp, urgent, the hunters were closing in. No, 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 he cursed under his breath, scanning the shadows where Luci had vanished. He had to move, now. The first figure emerged from the trees, a broad-shouldered man in a heavy hunting jacket. Rifle in hand, his expression was cold, unreadable, but his stance said everything. You need to step aside. The man ordered. That thing is dangerous. Martin's blood ran hot. He's not a thing. He spat. He's not dangerous. He's a wolf. The hunter countered. And a damn big one. Martin clenched his fists, his body trembling with barely restrained fury. He's never hurt anyone. He's never attacked. The hunter scoffed, stepping forward. Maybe not yet, but that's what they all say, until the first body drops. Martin's stomach twisted. They were here to kill Luci. They didn't care about the bond he had with him. Didn't care that Luci had been raised like a dog. Didn't care that he was more than just an animal. All they saw was a predator. Martin took a step back, his mind racing. He had to get to Luci before they did. But how? They had rifles. They had numbers. If they spotted Luci first, it was over. Then, an idea. He took a shaky breath, forcing himself to stay calm. If he couldn't run, he had to stall. You shoot him, and you'll have a lot more to answer for than just an animal kill. Martin bluffed, crossing his arms. Luci's a registered rescue case under my care. You take him out, and the authorities will be breathing down your necks before the blood dries. The hunter narrowed his eyes. That so? Yeah, Martin lied smoothly, standing his ground. Wildlife authorities know all about him. They're watching this case closely. You kill him, they'll have your heads. The men exchanged glances, clearly thrown off. It wasn't much, but Martin saw hesitation. That was all he needed. Without another word, he turned and bolted. Hey, get back here. The shouts rang behind him. But Martin didn't stop. He sprinted into the forest, his breath burning in his chest. Branches clawed at his arms. Mud splattered against his legs, but he didn't care. He had to find Luci before they did. A distant howl echoed through the night, a haunting, wounded cry. Martin's heart nearly stopped. Luci. Fueled by pure desperation, he ran toward the sound, dodging trees and leaping over roots. Every second counted. Then, through the mist, he saw him, Luci, cornered against a steep drop, his golden eyes reflecting the fear of an animal with no escape. Martin's breath caught. They were closing in, and he had just run straight into a trap. Martin's lungs burned as he came to a skidding halt, mud splattering beneath his boots. Luci was trapped. His massive form stood rigid, back pressed against the steep drop, his golden eyes darting from Martin to the advancing hunters. There was no way out. The men closed in, their rifles raised, fingers hovering over the triggers. The leader, the broad-shouldered man, stepped forward. His expression was eerily calm, but the cold glint in his eyes sent a chill down Martin's spine. You really shouldn't have run, he said, voice smooth, almost amused. Now, you've left us no choice. Martin positioned himself between Luci and the men, his hands shaking as he raised them in a desperate gesture of peace. Think, damn it, think. You don't have to do this, Martin said, forcing his voice to stay steady. He's not attacking, he's just scared. The leader tilted his head. A scared wolf is still a wolf. And one this size? That's a threat. Behind him, Luci let out a low, guttural growl, not aggressive but warning. He understood the danger just as much as Martin did. The hunter cocked his rifle. Step aside. No. Martin's breath came in ragged bursts. His mind raced through options. Run? No. Fight? He wouldn't stand a chance. Talk. Stall. Anything. You fire that shot, Martin said, and it's over for both of us. The man smirked. For you. Maybe. For you. Martin countered, taking a step closer, his voice gaining strength. Do you have any idea what's going to happen if you kill him? I told you, he's under protection. The authorities know. I have legal paperwork. The hunter's smirk faded just slightly. A flicker of doubt. Martin pressed on. Think about it. One dead wolf, and suddenly you're in court, answering questions about an endangered animal. The media will be all over it. You'll be branded as poachers. A rustling in the trees made the hunters stiffen. Another presence. For a split second, the group hesitated, rifles twitching toward the sound. Martin didn't wait. He lunged. With a burst of adrenaline, he threw himself at the lead hunter, grabbing for the barrel of the rifle. A gunshot cracked through the night. Luci roared, not a bark, but a deep, primal snarl. Chaos exploded. Martin wrestled against the hunter, struggling for control. The other men stumbled back, startled by Luci's sudden movement. And that was the only opening they needed. Luci launched forward, not attacking, but barreling through the gap between the hunters, knocking them off balance. An escape. Run, Luci! Martin shouted, breaking free and diving after him. Together, man and beast disappeared into the forest. Shouts followed, more gunfire, but they were already gone, vanishing into the night, with only the storm and the trees to shield them from the danger that still hunted them. The cold air burned Martin's lungs as he and Luci raced through the dense forest, their breaths merging into the misty night. The distant shouts of the hunters faded with every desperate stride. But Martin knew they weren't safe yet. The men wouldn't give up that easily. Luci ran beside him, his massive form moving with effortless grace despite the exhaustion weighing on them both. The golden glow of his eyes flickered with something primal, instinct, fear, and unwavering trust in the man who had risked everything for him. But how much longer could they run? A sudden burst of moonlight illuminated the clearing ahead. A road, a chance. Martin didn't hesitate, he veered toward it, gripping Luci's thick fur for balance. Just a little further, they emerged from the tree line, stumbling onto the damp pavement, breathless and battered. And then, a sound that made Martin's stomach drop. Engines, approaching fast. Headlights pierced the darkness, growing larger, brighter, until Martin realized it wasn't the hunters. It was the authorities. 3 black SUVs screeched to a stop, their doors flying open. Armed officers flooded out, weapons raised, scanning the area. A familiar voice called out, the wildlife inspector. Martin, stand down. Martin lifted his shaking hands, his heart pounding. It's us. It's Luci. The inspector's gaze darted from Martin to the massive black wolf at his side. Luci, though tense, remained still, his golden eyes flicking toward the officers. Not a threat, just waiting. Behind them, the forest rustled, the hunters were close. Martin turned back to the inspector. They're coming. They were going to kill him. The inspector didn't hesitate. Get them inside. A pair of officers rushed forward, guiding Martin toward the vehicles. Luci hesitated, his instincts screaming against the unfamiliar hands reaching for him. But Martin placed a firm hand on his side. A silent reassurance. Come on, buddy. We're okay now. With one final glance toward the forest, Luci stepped forward, allowing himself to be led into the safety of the vehicle. Seconds later, the first of the hunters burst through the trees, only to be met with the cold steel of drawn weapons. You're trespassing on protected land, the inspector barked, and unless you'd like to explain why you were hunting an endangered species, I suggest you drop your weapons. Martin didn't hear what happened next. He only knew that, for the first time in weeks, they were safe. Blank. Blank. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The hunters were arrested, and Luci's status as a protected animal was secured. But it wasn't just about the law, it was about their bond. Martin had fought for Luci, and in return, Luci had fought for him. Now, standing at the edge of their new sanctuary, far from the dangers of the city, far from those who sought to harm him, Martin watched as Luci ran freely for the first time in his life. The wolf lifted his head, eyes glowing like molten gold, and let out a deep, resounding howl, a call of freedom. Martin smiled. They had won. Martin's journey with Luci was more than a battle for survival. It was a lesson in trust, sacrifice, and the power of an unbreakable bond. From the moment he rescued the small, abandoned pup to the terrifying revelation that Luci was not a dog, but a full-blooded wolf, Martin was forced to make choices that tested the very limits of his courage and determination. But in those choices, In the hardships and the moments of fear, came a truth that few ever experience. Love and loyalty can defy even the wildest odds. One of the greatest lessons Martin learned was that true responsibility doesn't end with simply providing shelter. It extends to understanding, adapting, and fighting for those who depend on you. Luci was never just a pet. He was a creature of instinct, a being shaped by nature itself. Yet he had formed an unshakable connection with Martin. Society had rules, laws that dictated what could and could not be done with wild animals. But what happens when the heart's law contradicts the written law? Martin faced an impossible dilemma. Let Luci go and watch him perish, or fight for his right to live in a world that did not yet understand him. Fear was an ever-present force in their journey. Fear of losing each other. Fear of failure. Fear of the unknown. And yet, fear did not define them, it pushed them to act. It was fear that made Martin desperate enough to sell his home and uproot his life for Luci's sake. It was fear that led Luci to stand his ground, growling against the threats of the hunters. But in the end, it wasn't fear that saved them, it was trust. Trust that no matter what, they would protect each other. Another lesson that emerged from their journey was the realization that the world is not always ready to accept what it does not understand. People feared Luci simply because of what he was, a massive, powerful wolf. They judged him without knowing his story, without understanding his heart. Martin saw firsthand how society quickly labeled something as dangerous just because it didn't fit inside a neat, controlled box. But instead of giving up, he fought back, not with violence, but with proof. Proof that Luci was not a monster. That wolves, just like humans, could form connections, could feel loyalty, could show love. Through this experience, Martin also discovered that help often comes from the most unexpected places. The inspector who should have taken Luci away was the very one who gave them time. The strangers on the internet, people who had never met them, were the ones who made sure they had a future together. It was a reminder that while there are always those who will doubt, there are also those who believe. And sometimes, belief is all it takes to change everything. At the heart of their story was one undeniable truth. Love and loyalty transcend all barriers. Luci was not just an animal, and Martin was not just his owner. They were family. And in the end, family means fighting for each other, no matter the cost.